Well, so hello, everyone. I'm Rita McGrath. You probably knew that. And here with me is one of my heroes, someone who has just written a fantastic book and is just transitioning from his role as president of Southern New Hampshire University, an institution that he and his team have really transformed over the last few years, making possibilities more available for more students than I think anybody could have really thought. It's been a really great journey. So Paul LeBlanc, welcome.
Rita, it's so nice to be back with you, as always. Thank you.
As always, it's
Very
great.
kind words.
So we're talking about this great book. It's called Broken, and the subtitle is How Our Social Systems Are Failing Us and How We Can Fix Them. And Paul and I were just talking about how, with so much despair and dystopian forecasting going on in the world, and everybody saying everything's hopelessly broken, there is a path forward and there are bright spots. And so maybe just tell us a little bit about how you came to write the book. You open with some very personal stories of your own upbringing and background and how that led you to the path that you then later took.
Yeah. It's funny. I was writing a book that came out a year before Broken called Students First. I was writing for Harvard Ed Press, and I'm a pretty fast writer, generally speaking, and I can blast out drafts. Doesn't mean they're very good. They might need a lot of editing, but I'm fast. But I was so blocked in the middle of Students First, and I couldn't, I was just stuck. And someone asked me, it's a little circle of readers, and they said, well, what are you stuck on? I said, actually, an unrelated question. And the question is, do I think higher education can learn to love its students again? My wife kind of rolled her eyes and said, did it ever? And I was like, yeah, like I felt like I was loved as an undergraduate. I talk about that story. This reader, student, said, why don't you just take a little bit of time and answer that question? Just write about it. And I wrote feverishly, for 2 weeks, just all the time, and produced a whole bunch of chapters. Not many of them actually survived into the eventual version of Broken, but they were the foundation for that thinking. And then I got back to my project and it raced along again. So I had this thing that was, at some level of consciousness that I was grappling with.
Mm-hmm.
But I set out when I returned to the book. So I did my other book and kind of returned to let me see if there's something here. And I actually then went out and started talking to people in other systems of care. So when I use that phrase, I mean systems are often public systems that are meant to lift people up. K-12, higher ed, certainly, healthcare, mental health, treatment, addiction treatment, et cetera, et cetera. Theoretically, criminal justice, I think they don't really do that very much. Help people lift people up. And I talked to innovators. I found innovators who are in those spaces to say, tell me how you're innovating, how are you rethinking these systems that not only so often dehumanize the very people they're meant to serve, but often dehumanize the people who work in the systems themselves, the burnt out nurse or doctor, the burnt out K-12 teacher, so on, and found amazing people. And as they described their work, and I can share some stories real quickly if you like, I also then wanted to understand what is the sort of psychology, the sociology behind it. So I also then interviewed people like Jessica Benjamin at NYU, the noted feminist psychologist, and Matt Steinfeld, a psychologist at Yale, and Greg Elliott, who's a sociologist at Brown, who talks about mattering, which is the title of my very first chapter. And they gave me a framework for thinking about the innovation I was seeing. So I was both able to describe the innovations, but also describe, here's what's going on. And at the end, what's going on, fundamentally, the argument of the book is you can't transform a life. And that's what education's about. It's what healthcare is theoretically. Is about you can't transform a life if you're not in relationship with the person you're helping, that you're educating, serving, treating, et cetera. And our systems don't allow a lot of space for human relationship. And that's the thing we have to change at scale. So that was what led me to write Broken. And it was an amazing year of learning, of optimism. This is not pie in the sky stuff. These are people who are actually transforming big systems of care. So inspiring. And also I wove into that and got to places talking about how do we as leaders then think about this and what's demanded of us in that work.
Yeah, and in the last chapter, and I want to come back to earlier in the book, but in the last chapter, you talk about the energy, I guess I would say, that it takes to deal with the person who's right in front of you when you could just drop back and say, let the system handle it, right? And let the rules dictate and whatever. And, you
Yeah.
know, you tell a couple of personal stories about someone who basically usurped that person's role because they weren't doing well. In another case, let someone get fired who you would have worried about, undermining the authority of the person she was reporting to. And I think we've all been in those moments where you look back on it, you go, oh, if I'd just taken a little more time, if I'd just been more thoughtful, if I'd just, taken that deep breath and said, okay, what's required of me right in this moment?
And
We would have done better, right?
yeah. And what's required is sometimes not what the system re- requests of you, or demands of you in some cases, right? And that's the hard part. When do you do the thing that's genuinely human and empathetic, and you know in your heart is the right thing? But the system gives you cover. It says, no, 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 this is the way I'm supposed to do. Oh, here's the rules, ma'am. Like, I'm just following the rules. Don't get, and we've all encountered that kind of mindlessness. And, we call it mindless bureaucracy. It's actually kind of heartless bureaucracy. And as you know, Rita, the hardest chapter was the last chapter because I'm talking about leadership in that chapter. And I'm talking about, it took a long time to use it, the L word. I actually talk about love.
Mhm.
And if love being defined by a willingness to give people your time, to spend time to know them in their complexity, to know them as human beings, to be invested in them. And in some ways, it goes all the way back to the first chapter, which is about mattering. Like, do I matter to you?
Mm-hmm.
And when I've been doing this recently, I've been asking people, if you think about, I can name Mark Schlafman, Elizabeth Collins, and Helen Heineman, the three teachers that transformed my life. And when I think about them, sixth grade, high school, and undergraduate college, it wasn't that they were particularly great teachers. They were very good teachers, or that they knew their stuff. They did. They actually knew me. It wasn't about knowing their stuff. They knew me. They gave me their time. They made me feel like I mattered. They were interested. They understood my context. If I came in to talk about a paper that wasn't particularly good, they could look at me and go, "Hey, Paul, you seem out of sorts. What's going on?" And actually be interested in the answer. They lifted my sights. There's a chapter in the book about aspiration. I had three, and I ask people all the time now in audiences, lift your hands. How many of those teachers did you have? You can name, their names. How many do you have? And people will say 1, 5. Some people say 10. The average is 3.
Wow.
And we've had scores of educators in our lives, and lots of them being very good teachers. They did what they were asked to do. But how many of them loved us in the way that I described? And it's only them that actually transformed our lives.
I had a fascinating conversation the other day with Esther Dyson, of all people.
Oh,
and
yeah.
She was, of course, she's on the same hymn book we all are. And she made a really interesting distinction between attraction and love. And she was talking about, attraction is great. That's we get excited, we get interested. This is great. But love is about being needed and needing in return. And I've never thought about it that way. And it's interesting, this is kind of a subtext that I'm hearing in more and more places. Even Satya Nadella at Microsoft, you can't think of a more hard-nosed, edgy kind of company. And he talks about we need customers to love what we do. We need customer love. And I just think, whoa, that's amazing. So for those listening who don't know you, maybe tell a little bit about your analysis when you first arrived at SNHU, because I've always thought that was a very interesting breakthrough moment, right? Which was, what are your different students really needing from you?
Yeah, and if you'll permit me the liberty of just backing up a hair,
Sure.
because my personal experience, which I'll capture in 30 seconds, actually so much informed the mission and my sense of what I needed to do at SNHU. So, immigrant from hardscrabble farming village, kind of Appalachia and Maritimes of Canada, the poorest section of Canada still is today. Parents who had 8th grade educations. We immigrated when I was a kid to the Boston area, youngest of 5. So first in my family to go to college, learn to speak English in kindergarten, and grew up poor, never deprived. So I don't want to overstate it, but loving family. But my mother worked in a factory until she was in her 70s, and my dad was a day laborer, and the kind of work that breaks a man's body. He couldn't work early in his life because of that. So when I got to SNHU, I found an institution where the students looked a lot like me, a lot of first gen, a lot of working class kids. No one is having it handed to them. Our students who are working, almost full time in many instances, 30 hours a week. That was the campus, because mostly what SNHU was at the time was a campus in Manchester, New Hampshire. It was about 2,000 students, another 500 online. So I had a little online program when I came. And my background's in technology and education, obviously. And I sometimes do a session at the Harvard Grad School of Ed for new presidents. And I always say, when you arrive as a new president, it's like being dealt into a high stakes poker game. You get a hand. You don't get to choose your hand. The hand is dealt to you. Hopefully you sort of looked at the cards before you arrived. And then you have to play your best cards. And SNHU was unknown, third tier, if I can imagine 4 tiers in the world of higher ed.
Well, you just come from a smaller school, right?
I came from Marlborough, a little liberal arts college in Vermont. But, we had 7 years and had raised a lot of money and kind of got on the radar screen for doing innovative things. We had the first internet e-commerce programs, internet education program called the Internet Education Program at the time. So there was a lot of attention. And I think I was in a bunch of searches, and some of them with schools that were very highly selective, and I was probably the unlikely candidate. But it's when I got to SNHU that I felt at home. Mm-hmm. I found students that looked like me, and I thought, I love this mission. And, Clay Christensen is a dear friend, both of us. He was a friend of some 40 years, was on my board for 9 years, was trustee emeritus. And I think, he really shapes my thinking about this. He would say, I had 2 gifts, SNHU, 3 gifts, but he would say 2. We had no money. So we weren't fat and happy. And we didn't have a lot of tradition and status. So we weren't tied by, our sort of elevated sense. We weren't drinking our own Kool-Aid. My 3rd gift was that everyone I met during the search process says, we want to be better. And higher ed is so often trapped by its traditions, its prestige, its status, or a large endowment that allows you to kind of, be buffered from it's not many places even today with big endowments can say that, but it was true at the time. The card I saw was that we had this little online program. I could see what was happening. That nonprofits kind of looked down their nose at online ed. The for-profits rushed into it. Nature abhors a vacuum. So at their height, they educated 12% of all college students. Phoenix was 500,000 students at the time. And I thought, how do we compete with them? Because I can see the future here. I can see that for our students, especially for working adults, which had been in our DNA, we had all these, evening centers, continuing education centers for working adults. Online works better for them. I could see that. And I thought, this is the future. This is the bet I want to play. When you get dealt into a high stakes poker game, good poker players don't play, bad cards. They don't chase inside straights. Like, don't waste your time doing things that won't, we were never going to be a research university. I could take a nod and the faculty would have been happy, but it wouldn't have done anything. It wouldn't have moved the dial. But here's a chance we could move the dial. So that's what I set out to do. Today, we're about 250,000 students. We're the largest university in the country. Our operating budget back then was 50 million. Today, it's 1.4 billion. We serve a lot of students. This year, we'll graduate 44,000 students between our fall and spring commencements. So it's been a great, an overnight success of 21 years. Great teams, and teams that evolved. I mean, a lot of lessons about how you build and scale. And, in 2012, we were well on our way. We were number 50 in the country's on the Babson list of the 50 largest online providers. We were number 50 among nonprofits. And 3 years later, we were number 4, and that was a rocket ride. And I had no idea what I was doing. We broke everything. We didn't know how to scale. The next time we scaled was the first year of the pandemic, and we were prepared that things would go in the other direction. But in fact, we grew by 46,000 students and hired 1,600 more full-time faculty in 12 months, all of it remote. And this time, our scaling systems held. And we were strained. We were working hard to keep up, but we didn't break. And I love that, because for me, I have an old friend from the South who says there's no education in the second kick of the mule. First kick, we learned. Second kick, we ducked. We missed it, and didn't get hit by the mule. We actually pulled it off. So learned a lot along the way, and had moments where I questioned if I was the right person to continue to lead. And I think we all have to ask that question periodically. Am I still the right person for what this organization needs? So, long answer to your short question, but been a heck of a ride over the last 21 years. And I will step down on June 30th after that time.
And what led you to make that decision?
A couple of things. One is I do think I'm haunted by the colleagues I've known in my career who stayed too long. In some cases, just a year too long. And it was the difference between a storied legacy and everyone just remembers the last bad year. And there are lots of reasons why that happens, and sometimes it's out of your control. But I thought I definitely don't want to be that guy. Two, I think I'm cognizant of that. You start to fresh perspective is helpful. I think same friend from the South, that's all my best quotes, said to me, Paul, if there's a pile of dirt in your living room and you walk around it long enough, at some point you forget there's a pile of dirt in your living room until company comes over. Like fresh eyes, actually. Why, so there was a little bit of that. I'm not getting any younger, I'm 66. I thought, there's interesting work to be done and probably in a different context. So what could that look like? And of course, then AI came barreling into our world in November of 22, and I'd already planned to step down, but that just confirmed the choice. And now I'm heading up a new AI and education company with going from 13,000, 14,000 employees to 7 and a bunch of contractors. Yeah, so all those things I think all contributed. Yeah.
So just to return to the book for a minute, because as I said, I'm such a fan of the book, and how much how much hope there is in it, and there's a lot of criticism too, and there's a lot of darkness in terms of the failures of so many systems. But you've got these lovely examples of things that are working. But I want to kind of get to the observation you make about scaled systems, and I'd never thought about it this way before, which is scaled systems like symmetry, they like clear
repeatable process,
repeatable processes. They're like, choo, and they don't like humans who are messy and unpredictable and time consuming, and they've always got the dark sides. They've always got things that you just roll your eyes and
they're messy, hard to measure. They don't operate predictably.
Exactly. And I think what's really very enlightening about how you show how these scaled systems don't work, and one of the examples I've used a lot as a quote was your example of a student who was trying to bring over credits for some calculus she'd taken, but it was beyond the 10-year window that SNHU normally allowed. I love the way she sort of came to you and was like, I don't believe calculus has fundamentally changed in the last 10 years.
Absolutely. And that was a great example. And we are a place that's pretty student-centric, our teams, but there was this rule and the algorithm rules, and I was worried about the ability of that person in that seat, our seat, to say to a student, this is the rule, but I'm going to waive it in your, systems don't like to give that sort of room, because we fear the abuse. We fear the human in the loop, expression from the world of AI we all live with now. So I think it's interesting. I think systems, and I'd make an argument that it's probably some confluence of Taylorism, right, which has so much informed our industrial way of thinking about production. But when you bring that to human work, I'm not sure it carries over so well. Then add, so post-Reagan, distrust of government, wanting to spend less. So we try to move, we want efficiency and get humans out, and humans are messy. So you get all of this coming together. And the result of that is we build systems of care that try to keep expensive human engagement to a minimum. All of these innovators are flipping the script. So the question they ask is, if human relationship is at the heart of our work, what are the most important human relationships? When are those moments? What does that look like? And I'm going to hold that ground sacred. And then I will automate and use technology for everything else to get to scale, which is how we did this at SNHU. Our model is built actually on the relationship of an advisor and a student who stays with that student for the whole of their journey. But everything else, as much as we can, we try to apply technology. So when a student calls and simply wants to know their balance on their bill, that's a transaction. We don't need a human. When a student calls with a financial question, sometimes it's transactional, but sometimes it's a financial crisis and we're this close to losing them. And I want a human in that conversation. I want to say, hey, Rita, what's going on? You seem distressed. I just don't know. The money's not adding up. Well, okay, let's back up. Talk me through it. And in those moments, those human interventions are the difference between a student's success and a student failing. And the real one, the one that drives us all the time, is the advisor, because they're with you the whole time, right? And what we need to know is that we have someone in our corner, that it matters to the organization. So I use the example of what was then called Aurora Health, but it's changed. It's now One Medical, I believe. It's been acquired by Amazon. But Alexander Packard, he goes by Xander. They use a model, a multi-state large healthcare system now, in which they, and this is going to sound counterintuitive, actually reduce the amount of time you get with a clinician. Minimal, because that's expensive time, right? That's expertise and expensive time. But you get a healthcare coach. And that healthcare coach is really, those healthcare know you. They know you, your background, your context. So while the physician may be with you all of 3 minutes and leaves the room, the healthcare coach is like, all right, Rita, let's talk about what you just heard. Low sodium diet. What does that mean to you? Well, I'm going to use the salt shaker less. Well, a lot of salt and processed food. Let's look at your menu of the last 3 days. What were you having? Who does your shopping? Or I remember you told me your niece does your shopping for you. Let's get her on the phone. Like, time consuming. But a healthcare coach is a lot less expensive than a physician that took 10 years and $1 million to train.
Mm-hmm.
And they have great results. And people say, yeah, but is that scalable? Well, Amazon acquired them and they don't do anything that isn't scalable, right? So there are lots of examples about this. But it does force you to rethink that question, like, what is the fundamental human thing that is needed here in this moment?
Mm-hmm. Well, and sort of in parallel with that, you talk a lot about the social distance between those care workers and the people they're trying to serve. And I have to tell you, and I've used this example a lot, when you said most people in the United States don't actually know a doctor one-on-one. And I read that and I reread that 3 times. And I said, I must be misreading this because, in my world, like, you can't throw a cat without hitting a doctor, right?
I was going to say, we all know doctors.
But then I thought about it and I thought, well, sure, you who went to an Ivy League undergraduate, did a master's at Columbia, did a PhD at Wharton, now live on a beautiful glass building on the Upper West Side of Manhattan. Of course, doctors, but when you think about it, most people don't have that luxury. And I was, as my husband would say, gobsmacked because I never thought about it. Well, but also with these systems where you've got such social distance between the person, who needs the care and the people supposedly delivering it, it creates such a barrier.
Absolutely. And that translates into the world I live in, you live in, which is students. If you take a first generation student, we know that they often come to us with imposter syndrome. They're loath to go ask the teacher for help because they don't want to signal they don't belong. There's really interesting work about the class distinctions between faculty and their students quite often. And again, for the students I care most about, students who are underserved, there's a context that teacher, that faculty member literally doesn't get. And increasingly, of course, there's a technological context that a lot of faculty don't get. So yeah, these things are really important. And I do love when someone who has walked the path actually now is in a leadership role or in a role as a caregiver, educator, or whatever that is, because I think that closes that gap. But oftentimes the person being cared for doesn't know. So Greg Elliott at Brown University did a lot of work on first-gen students, help them understand that giving a full scholarship isn't a solution. It only gets you in the game. If every signal you encounter once you arrive tells you don't belong, you're going to struggle to be successful. So he persuaded Brown to open up a center for first-generation college students. And when they arrive on campus, he makes sure that as many faculty and staff who were themselves first generation are there. And that changes the conversation. Like, whoa, wait a minute, Professor McGrath, you were first generation? And you get to say, oh yeah, I've been down this path. Mm-hmm. Right? And now you need to come talk to me when you're struggling. Like, don't wait. It changes the game because now I'm connecting. Mm-hmm. Right? And that's what Jessica Benjamin talks about. Like, you have to be in relationship with. And oftentimes she has this notion of you have to find an identity that's different than either of you. You're no longer just my faculty member, distant, esteemed, up high. I'm no longer just a student. We are both something else. And that's where those connections happen. And in addiction treatment, you see a lot of people who themselves had overcome substance or addiction, or were in families with addiction, right? Like they have that sympathetic connection in that way.
And you said you had some other examples that you were finding when you're doing the early research for the book. I'd love to
My
hear from
favorite one, I mean, my sort of hero, of this book in many ways is Loris Betts, who was the CEO of the University of Utah healthcare system, the
you.
largest healthcare system in Utah when he was CEO. Also, one of the most poorly rated in the country when it comes to patient satisfaction. And he talked about, he told me the story about his wife had an unexpected attack of kidney stones. Apparently, some of the worst pain you can have as a human being, from all accounts. Not going whatever had been there. He rushes her to one of his hospitals, where he watches her get treated in terrible ways, like dehumanizing ways. So much so that when he was telling me, I stopped. Like, wait a minute, did they know like the connection? He goes, I was in the room. And he goes, imagine what would happen if it was some poor schmuck off the street. Here's the CEO and his wife. And, he could have chalked that up to a bad clinician or just a bad day at the hospital. But instead, he owned it and said, wait a minute, this is happening on my watch. And he reached out to the department. They got patient feedback. And what he realized along the way was that he was getting all these averages, but he wasn't getting the worst cases. And I actually have a chapter in the book about, as leaders, we have to be collectors of stories, including the ones that make us uncomfortable. So he said to them, give me the worst stories. Give me the letters that I don't see. And he had a brilliant idea. He reached out to many of those patients, asked if they'd be willing to share their stories and be videotaped. And he hired a crew, didn't tell anyone, and they went and videotaped these interviews. Then he brought in his staff, his clinicians, into an auditorium, turned on the lights, played the video, and he said, people are crying. They kept saying, this isn't us. And he's like, this is us. No one else. Like, we're the ones, like, this story you're hearing, that's us. And it was a kind of a breakthrough. Like, you had to break through the believing your own narratives, et cetera, et cetera. And then he set out in a multi-year, and it was fast. I mean, he changed the culture within, I want to say 5 years. They went from the bottom 20% of systems in the country in terms of patient out to number one, not number of top percent, number one ranked healthcare system. But to do that, he had to do, everyone who does this says, you have to look at what gets rewarded and how the money flows through a system. Where does the money go? Budgets actually reflect priorities and values. So he started to look at what gets. So as you know, physicians are often rated, how many patients can I see in a day? Which means they're going to spend less time with you, which means they're going to spend less time knowing who you are and connecting as a human being. And he said, at the end, when I asked him, like, what was critical? Like, you did so many things to get this right. You changed the incentive systems. You changed what was getting assessed in performance reviews, et cetera. He said, at the end of the day, patients just want their caregivers to know them as human beings. That's all. And the research, this, Rita, right? Like, people will sue their physician less often, even in cases of genuine malpractice, if they have a relationship.
Yes.
Oh, it's Dr. McGrath. I know it was terrible, but she would never do that intentionally. No, of course not. I would never sue her. I mean, right? That's the psychology of this. It's not why you should do it, but it speaks powerfully in our litigious society to what happens when you actually have a human relationship with someone.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
So what else? What else did he do? So he changed the incentives. He changed the
incentives. He moved away from how many patients do you see in a day. Managers of departments were now getting their bonuses, their annual bonuses tied to patient satisfaction. Right. So the reward system starts to change. He's shown a spotlight. Like, part of this is your bully pulpit. So shine a light on the behaviors, the stories where people say, I had this amazing experience with Dr. So-and-so. You know what people don't want to do? They don't want to be the other guy, right? They want to be that doctor, right? And look at this, plays out all the time. I have a daughter in academia, and she loves students and they adore her. And she's a really good teacher and always has been. But I'd say to, like, hey, honey, how are you doing on your book? And how are we doing on those publications? And in that system, unnamed for this purpose of this conversation and her future. But in that system, which talks so much about the centrality of students, none of their rewards for their faculty actually line up with what they say.
Mm-hmm. That's something I fear for higher ed. I mean, there's a wonderful piece that was written about business school education, which of course is my world. And it was something like the quality of teaching in Chinese original poetry, something like that. And What this author did was likening the reward system in higher ed to a system under Chairman Mao, where his goal was to produce 1 million pieces of original Chinese poetry in the year, and that was what was rewarded. And indeed, they produced 1 million pieces of
People the bad Chinese poetry. Yeah.
But I mean, I remember somebody somewhere reading that the average, prestigious journal publication for a business school professor gets read by, like 10 people. And I'm like, well, if I knew who they were, I would have addressed it to them, in the front of
the sent them a letter. Yeah.
But I do worry that our system of incentives are not well aligned and sometimes quite contradictory. When I was at Wharton, which is where I did my PhD, there was a wall which had the pictures of all the best teacher award winners.
Yep.
And the running joke was if you made it to that wall, you were out, on your way out the door because you'll never get it.
That's very funny. Yeah, and it's not enough to put the pictures on the wall. It's got to be really in the incentives. For what things do you get promoted? And this is complicated because universities in that setting are asked to do multiple things. So we are asked to be factories of scholarship and research and publication because that's a way of disseminating and promulgating our best thinking. And it's important to society we do that. But if we are going to mix that function also with teaching, then you're starting to make decisions about what gets weighed in what ways, et cetera, et cetera. So yeah, it's not that it's not complicated, but every innovator with whom I spoke about this got back again and again and again to coaching models at the heart of the work we do. And I think as I look at AI and this question about how many of those transformational teachers did you have, there are a lot of people who walk through our society and their answer would be zero. And I'm intrigued, the new company that I'm leading is looking at how do we, without pretending that we're human, I'm like really worried about, I mean, if you saw OpenAI's most recent announcement earlier this week, right? And human beings are wired to respond to voice. So now it sounds like a human being. It's engaging. And hey, Rita, how are you? Wait a minute.
It's like the movie Her. I mean, it's like,
exactly. And I know that, right? I mean, Sam Altman tweeted out one word, her, when they announced. And I watch how quickly we anthropomorphize our technology. Like we have a simple chatbot that our students love. It's called Penny. It increases their persistence rate. It really drives success. And at a student, we interviewed them. We have a video someplace of them talking about it. And students said, I came home, I was really tired. I had an assignment due the next day. I was like, oh, never mind. I just want to go to bed. And then I got a text from Penny. And Penny said, hey, your assignment is due tomorrow. Just a reminder, do you want me to connect you to the writing center or do you need any other help? And she goes, I was like, all right, Penny, I'll do it. Now, she went on to say, I know Penny's not real, but it feels like someone's in my corner. That's pretty powerful.
That's very powerful.
And how do we harness that for all those who don't have someone in their corner, but at the same time, make sure that like in our team, we were saying, look, if we're so good at this, that people, we have, 1 million users in darkened bedrooms looking at their computer and thinking they're in a relationship with a human, we should pull the plug on the project. Like, how could we use the power of that technology to improve learning, but to free people up for more fulfilling, genuinely human connection? And I think that's going to be our challenge as we move into the age of our algorithmic co-workers, assistants, whatever you want to call these things that we'll all be working with.
Well, you had a vision sort of toward the end of the book, and I'd love to kind of build on the conversation about AI because you talk about human work initiative and co-ops and kind of putting layers of humanity kind of where we don't have it right now. And the thing that I find fascinating is we've got the money. I mean, the money's there. It isn't being spent in the right places, but we're not talking about sort of having to suddenly raise billions of extra dollars that we just kind of already.
And I've loved that you said that, Rita, because you've in some ways preempted the question that always gets thrown back at me when I talk about the Human Work Initiative. This is an idea that Jamie Marasotis, that Illumina Foundation, I cooked up. And we're both a bit of critics of UBI, Universal Basic Income, because I think UBI simply gives you enough money not to revolt, not enough to flourish and thrive as a person. So is that where we're setting the bar for our society? What if we could have a sort of an alternative that would allow people to flourish in jobs that make them feel great and feel connected and actually improve their community? So here's what I would say. If you'll permit me, I'm going to come back. I'm going to circle back and with a more fulsome discussion than I did even in the book at the time, which is that since the advent of ChatGPT and this tidal wave of AI that's washing over us, I think that the role of universities as knowledge factories, we create knowledge workers for a knowledge economy. That's being upended in a world where now we're no longer the best knowledge worker available. That's here. And we're getting there very, very fast. So the World Economic Forum projects a displacement of 85 million jobs next year alone, 2025, not far away. There are others that project even more dire sort of job displacement in knowledge industries, arguing that AI will do for white collar knowledge work, excuse me, what automation did to blue collar work. If that's true, I'm in the camp that widely believes it probably is, then we're going to reinvent a lot of our jobs, and a lot of those jobs will go away. I mean, PwC's invested a couple of $1 billion in AI. It's not so they can hire more accountants, right? And call centers now are shifting quickly, and like jobs are already slowly, but it's going to pick up that momentum, will pick up speed. So if those jobs are going to be done by AI, those knowledge jobs, and I love Stuart Russell, the noted Berkeley computer scientist. He does a series of lectures called the Reith Lectures, Reith, for the BBC. And in one of them, he says about the knowledge economy, imagine in the past if we had said to our ancestors, in the future, this bright future, you will go to work at a place, well, it's a big box. It's called an office building, but it's essentially a big box. And when you go inside, you'll sit in a little glass box called a cubicle, and you'll spend 8 hours staring at a little lit box called a computer display. They would say, that's hell. I'm running in the other direction, right? So now think about what we need in our society, what I argue in the book, which is that if knowledge jobs go away, there is an opportunity to do the thing we know we need to do. We should flood our K-12 system with talented teachers and counselors and social workers and coaches and staff. We should rebuild a mental health care system that is completely decimated. America uses prisons as a mental health care system today. We need to absolutely staff that with talented clinicians, right? Medical staff, all kinds of people. We need to create a system of affordable care and compassionate geriatric care for an aging society. We don't have one. Anyone who's listening, who's dealt with aging parents, knows it's a nightmare. Not just an expense, but also just finding places that are adequately staffed and that are actually caring for people at end of life. Like, we don't lack a need for human jobs. AI is not doing any of those jobs. It may help, but it is not going to replace human beings. We go back to that earlier point. We just don't like to pay for human jobs. These are jobs that are low paid, unsupported, they don't have status. But that may change, because what Carlotta Perez tells us is that when you have a paradigm shifting technology like this, all the old winners sometimes become losers, the outsiders become insiders, that which was successful becomes suddenly failing, and new opportunities, new ways of thinking about the world emerge. So I know Bill Gates has some self-interest when he says AI will kill Amazon, but I think AI will, in fact, upend things that feel pretty unassailable right now. And what I hope will happen is that if we see knowledge jobs go away, it becomes an opportunity to reinvent a society that feels pretty broken, because which of these systems is working for us right now? I don't know many people who are walking around feeling really good about the state of these various functions that are important to us as a society. But imagine what it looks like if you're sending your kids off to a school with amazing teachers where they are loved and they're flourishing and they think differently about the world. And what if our medical healthcare system is a compassionate one in which your caregivers actually knew you? We can build that. And to your point, we can afford it. We can absolutely afford it. Bill Gates says tax the robots. There are lots of ways of thinking about how we do this. But if you take a look at what it costs us to keep someone incarcerated versus what it costs us to create a great teacher in a school and pay them well. And here's the interesting place where I take some heart. I'm sure you know David Autor, the labor economist at MIT. He has a great essay, recent essay, and I think it's called Noemi Magazine, but it's about, well, his argument is that AI will reinvigorate the middle class. And he uses the example of expensive and hard to find expertise. He uses the example of doctors. We don't have enough of them in the US. We don't produce enough. They take forever to do, 10 years or more. They're really expensive. $1 million are well more than that. And there are whole swaths of the society that don't have access to good doctors. Even people with privilege are waiting longer and longer to see a doctor. And what he argues is that's because doctors are trained with a high level of expertise to do something Chris Dede at Harvard calls reckoning. You walk in with symptoms, and what their training is about is like, I'm going to figure out what this is with great precision. I'm going to order the right test. I'm going to rule things out. I've seen a lot of patients. I know what this is. And then I'm going to get you the right treatment plan with a high level of reckoning or prediction about what's going to work best for you. That's what AI is really, really, really good at. So what if we could flood our society with nurses, far less long to train, far less expensive to train, so they have foundational knowledge. They know how to put lines in. They know how to work with you physically. They know their basic anatomy and physiology. So foundational knowledge. They also have high emotional skill compared to a lot of our physicians. Sorry, but I would say most of us often prefer our nurses to our doctors. And now they could have in their pocket the same expertise as a doctor. And those are good middle class jobs. Those jobs start at $130,000 a year. And we could flood our country with them. And the economics would work. Like, let's worry less about doctors. If he's right, it's a compelling argument. Doesn't make doctors real happy, and we'll see massive resistance. But I think we could get there. So that's my hopeful view, is that maybe AI in the replacement of humans in the knowledge economy is an opportunity to actually do the things that make people feel really good at the end of the day, working with others, lifting them up. I mean, my best days are when I'm encountering students and they're sharing their stories of transformation and how we helped.
I love that. I love that. I am seeing a lot of these really bright spots. So there's another person I'm going to be talking to in a few weeks called Susanna Fox, who's written a wonderful book called Rebel Health. And in the book, she talks about how patients basically are taking matters into their own hands in many cases. And she gives a fascinating example of parents of a child with type 1 diabetes. And the trouble with that is overnight, they could die, if their insulin levels go back.
Yep.
And the way that a parent has to care for that child is you set your alarm for every 2 hours, and then you go down the hall, and hopefully you don't wake your child up, but you check their monitor, to see what levels are all right. And the manufacturers never thought anything of it. But what started to happen now was they using the power of the internet, they started to connect with other parents who were in this same situation. And then they connected with this guy who's like a hacker dude. And he looked at it, he said, well, that's absurd. And he hacked the device, which the medical manufacturers had said, oh, no, our data is our data. You don't get the data. But he hacked the device so that now the data could be transmitted to the phone. So now you still have to get up every 2 hours, but now you can just look at your phone and you don't have to wake your child up. Okay. And so I'm just seeing all over the place, some of these empowering technologies are actually giving people agency to fix those kind of situations without having to sort of resort to a greater power, which I think is part of the power of these things, right?
Completely, and I had a chance, the system we're trying to work in this new company I keep mentioning, where we're really taking a clean sheet of paper approach to learning and saying, what if we could rethink learning in the age of AI, really centering human relationships and human flourishing? So connecting to wellness devices, for example, and being able to say to you, hey, Rita, are you sure do you want to start this next module? As you know, you haven't had a good night's sleep in 3 nights in a row. Maybe you want to go to bed, right? Like even something as simple as that. But really, but in building the system and trying to make it radically affordable through the deployment of AI, I had a chance to meet with the Minister of Education and the Prime Minister of Rwanda in October. And we had a we do a lot of work, as you know, with refugee populations in Rwanda and other places in Africa. And I said, if we build a system, as after I explained everything we're trying to do in detail, I'd love to get 1,000 initial users to test it. Like we need to do some early testing, make sure it works, the data flow. And when you're talking about wellness and well-being, that looks different culturally. So even that, like we want to test it in other different settings. And the Prime Minister was shaking his head. And I thought, oh God, like, what? I guess he doesn't like my idea, this is not going well. He said, I don't need 1,000. I need hundreds of thousands because I have swaths of my country where there's no education happening today. Like this.
What's the company called? And tell us more. Tell us the vision for it.
Sure. So it's called Human Systems. If you go to humansystems.com, you will see what might literally be the least helpfully informative website in the history of the internet. That's not even words. We just had to protect our trademark. But it was co-founded with George Siemens. So George is a longtime friend. Many of your folks will know his name. He's credited with creating the first MOOC. He's credited with creating a field of data, learning science, He's amazing, and he's one of the top people in the world in AI and education. I've known George a long time, and we were at the big ASU GSV EdTech Summit last year, and we were bemoaning the degree to which we felt like our colleagues in higher ed, presidents and boards, were really not fully grasping the magnitude of change that's coming our way. And that there was this opportunity to really rethink education in fundamental ways and actually shift learning and education from questions of epistemology. What do you need to know to be an X? That's an epistemological question. What do you need to know to be a lawyer? What do you need to know to be an accountant, a nurse, etc.? To questions of ontology, which is, how do you want to be as a human being in the world? Like, those are more interesting questions. Interestingly, they're questions we tend to link to the humanities, which we don't fund very much. We may also tell you something about what's wrong with education. But I think, so at the end of that conversation, I said, George, I'm going to be stepping down from SNHU. I was going to take a sabbatical. Why don't we instead just reinvent learning? Just that. And we shook on it. And I just lured him away from his joint appointment at the University of Texas and University of South Australia. And we, a merry band of 7 full-time people and 35 engineers and others, contractors. We're trying to build this and really rethink, again, clean sheet of paper, no assumptions about what has to be there, what doesn't have to be there. But, we're not trying to compete with higher ed. We're trying to serve all those people for whom higher ed just doesn't work. Like all those, as our friend Clay would say, non-consumers or under-consumers, right? And there are a lot of them in the world, and that's what we're trying to build.
So will people be able to get some kind of credential or some kind of badge or because I've been for a long time, as you know, that once we unbundle the degree, which with today's technologies, there's no reason we have to have this. It's like a CD, right? You have to buy 20 songs to get the one that you really wanted. But once we unbundle that, the whole edifice of higher ed just comes crashing down because, if I can take the best, and Clay talked about this a lot, if I can get the best course from the best professor from any school that I want, right, then that changes the whole the game in terms of how you get educated and who you pick to be part of your educational experience.
Yeah, I know. It's such a great question, Rita. So yes, the idea is to, learning is hard. So people don't come to learning by and large as a free form grazing, that model's never really held up very much. Like, I'm coming to you because I'm stuck. I need an economic opportunity. And my boss says, if I just really got much better at project management, he could put me in this role. Okay, then let's give you project management. We'll create a program for you around that. Here's the interesting thing. And it's the big leap, and it's a swing for the fences in some ways. Question, which is, if we really do believe that the future of education is going to be human questions versus epistemological questions, then we worry less about how do we teach you project management. We want to build a platform that's less about the knowledge you need to learn. It's there, but more about you. So can I know Rita in ways that I can deliver that education in a very finely tuned way? Hey, I know, and the system will learn by engaging with you. I can see, imagine the system could talk, that Rita's attention wavers after 10 minutes. I'm going to start chunking the learning in 9-minute chunks because that's going to be her optimal piece. I can tell from Rita's Apple Watch, that her heart rate's elevated. That's usually a sign of anxiety or something's going on, of stress. So as she wants to start a lesson, maybe the next first question asked, because you can't learn if you're anxious or stressed. You won't learn as well as Rita. Your heart rate's elevated. Are you feeling stressed? And you say, no, I'm just I just came in, I've been running, blah, blah, blah. Let's jump in. I'm excited. Like, great, let's jump in. But the system you might say, no, I'm actually really stressed. I got way too much to do, blah, 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 blah. And then the system might say to you, then how about we walk you through a mindfulness centering exercise? And integrated into learning. And then, you do that, and 5 minutes later, so note that your heart rate went from 82 to 69. You seem like you're ready to go. You want to start, and you say, yep. So the idea is maybe, and I hate to use this phrase because it's so discredited from its past checkered history, genuine personalized learning. Like learning not built around what do you need to know, learning built around you as a student. And the what you need to know question doesn't go away, but it's not the most interesting question because we all need to learning all the time, right? We'll be upskilling and learning all the time.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Well, and one of the things that I know is on a lot of employers' minds is how do I upskill a workforce, on an ongoing
Yeah.
basis in a way that fits with what they need to be doing day to day, and it's still a big question mark for a lot of people.
And the interesting thing we're seeing from employers is they certainly are focused on job situated skills, and they talk now a lot about future skills. What are the skills that their employees need? But they also talk about distinctly human skills, empathy, working on teams, leading teams, navigating culture, navigating difficult conversations. Like these are the things that they're seeing their people struggle with. And those are not epistemological questions. Those are very human questions. And if we can mail those, so we talk about a kind of DNA spiral. So wellness, empathy, human skills interwoven with the sort of practical skills of a particular job or a function that needs to be learned. So it's a fun project. Um, SNHU is our primary investor. It's a public benefit company. It's a for-profit company, and we've had lots of people say, "I'd be really interested in learning more, and maybe even investing." I was like, "You should run the other way. This is a massive swing for the fences. It's highly complex. It has a very high probability of failure, but we're learning a lot, and we'll see. It's good stuff."
So is it sort of a personality that talks to you on your phone or something? I mean,
So we do believe the dialogic is the way we will interface. I have two big bets that we're making. These are not profound, and if you watch the OpenAI spring announcement of earlier this week, you saw it vividly demonstrated, right? Which is this her-like ability. So, but I think the future of the dialogic will be for the learning and the engagement will be the feeling of sitting across the table from a great teacher, someone who knows you, right? We all know what that looks like. So that's the first one. And then I'm a big believer that glasses are going to be the key, will be our key interface. So in the the OpenAI demonstration, when they wanted to show the ability to get help from the ChatGPT 4.0, O for Omni, they held up a phone and used the camera as he, held up the phone while he did a math problem, and then said, "Why can't I solve for this?" And ChatGPT says, "Well, you need to move the X and blah blah blah," right? What a clumsy way to do that. What if my glasses were smart? What if I could just look at it and say, "I'm working on something, give me guidance"? What if that something is actually a physical process where the system is watching you and saying, "Oh, don't connect that red wire to that blue wire. Like, stop." Oh, you're right. And right. So the Institute for the Future out of Palo Alto, it used to be called Xerox PARC. They have this wonderful phrase and concept of artifacts from the future. So things in our current world which are not successful, but when we look back, we will see that they predicted something that later became profoundly important. So if you think about this, when I was I was a PI for a big ARPA grant with Apple, and I remember being in Cupertino in the '90s and said, "Do you want to see the next big thing?" I was like, "Yeah, like of course you put it that way." And they brought in an Apple Newton. Do you remember, Rita, the Apple Newton? It was this big clumsy thing, it was huge. Like you open it, but it had a stylus, you could write, and it would translate your writing. Like I wrote, my wife's name is Pat, and I wrote, "Dear Pat," and it came back as "Deal Pot," which is
right. I mean, it was so
maybe like bad career advice, but
remember Doonesbury, the Doonesbury cartoon about that.
but you could keep your calendar. Well, it was a failure. It was a massive failure. But what came next was the Palm Pilot. And the Palm Pilot was the BlackBerry, and then the BlackBerry was the iPhone.
Right.
And I look back and say I think Google Glasses, the universal symbol of a nerd that year, I had my pair, but I think Google Glasses, for all of the massive failure that it was, I think it actually predicts. I think in the future we will say, that was the first attempt. And now I have, if I can show you real quick, your listeners, but if you haven't had them yet, the new Ray-Ban Metas. So these are smart glasses connected to AI through Meta collaborates with Ray-Ban, and they don't really look nerdy as Google Glasses. But this is a camera. I can turn it on by tapping. I can look at something and say, "Meta, what is this building I'm looking at?"
Wow.
And it will answer the question. In fact, it just came on because it heard me say, "Hey, Meta." So what happens when you think about how do we connect the physical world, our physicality and presence in it, and AI all together, I think it's going to have to be some analog device. And I was with Nitin Noria just a week ago, the longtime dean of the Harvard Business School. And I said this, afterwards he grabbed me and said, I'm making the same bet. I think that's going to be the analog device that makes all this come together. So we get the team is actually playing with these and seeing, how could we start using these built into the learning as well. So when you think about learning that includes performance-based assessment, because we think the future is not what you know, it's what you can do with what you know in an age of AI. So if you think about that, what if I'm going into a meeting and I can record the meeting by simply hitting my glasses? And then the artifact of that video, let's say a half-hour meeting, then the AI sort of does a run through for me and say, how did I do in that meeting? It's like, well, you interrupted Rita 3 times when she was speaking. So if you've played with Poised, for example, it gives you that kind of feedback. You can add it to your computer. It would do this for a Zoom call. You talked for 45% or 50 or 80% of the time. You use filler words like, thank you for the feedback. I'll work on it, right? So really kind of amazing possibilities start to open up.
I love that. Oh, I love that. And for kids too, that's great. I remember one of the best pieces of parenting advice I ever got was catch your kids doing something right and reward them for it.
I love that. Yeah, I love that. Yeah, yeah.
Oh my goodness, this time has flown. I don't want to overstay my welcome. I do want to be helpful. So if I can be useful in the new venture, let me know. I mean, I'm
Rita, you're always can be helpful to us. We'll follow up.
Please do. So people can catch you on humanfutures.com. I know you're active on X, which used to be Twitter. Anything else that you'd like people to know at this juncture?
No, I see so many people wringing their hands. And the thing I would share with you, I think you know this because you follow me and actually follow each other, Rita, but I'm going to be a grandfather for the first time next month. And I was thinking about this and reflecting on what does it mean to bring a child into the world? And there are lots of post-apocalyptic, we've all seen Terminator, so we know how AI could go wrong. So we could wring our hands about it, or we could get active as educators and people who are leaders in their respective fields on this call and start to shape the future. Like, I don't want to stand by and be reactive and, put my head in the sand. So I think we all have to be very vocal. And we've suffered greatly for our lack of attention when social media came into our world. And I think we've paid a heavy, heavy price for it.
Jonathan Haidt's work, of course, on
the new book.
Yeah, the new book on the anxious generation.
So I think with AI, the thing that gives me a little bit of optimism, there's a lot of conversation right now about how do we not make those mistakes again? How do we regulate in sensible ways that don't impede innovation, but don't, fool people into thinking that their machine is actually a human relationship? No more than likes in social media are actual friendships. They're not. They're shallow. And, talking to my AI assistant is a little bit like talking to my toaster. It's just a piece of technology. So how do we use this to do the things it's really good at and can be helpful to us, while in fact impelling us to be out in the world more connected than we are today as neighbors and fellow citizens and just good human beings? So that's my hope for my grandchild. And I hope you are all part of that, because we all have kids and grandkids and neighbors' kids.
Absolutely. Well, thank you so much for spending the time.
Oh, my pleasure, Rita.
The book is great. It's called Broken. I would encourage you to get it, and we'll be staying in tune for your next chapter.
Thank you so much, Rita.
Thanks.
Bye. Pleasure being with you. Bye-bye.